Very good. Yeah. They're not going to do it. No. Don Hudson can get away with making fun of Sandra, but I can't make fun of my wife, and she better get down here, though, so we can start. I do want to go home with her tonight. Well, this is a new experience for us, and I want you to know I appreciate very much the number of you are here. We'll see how this goes. The elders, what you need? Is that better? Okay, good. The elders have talked about this for some time and tried to figure out what's the safest way to do it, and we're hoping that with the changes coming in our situation here in the city, that this may be an effective thing for us to do. So we're going to begin this. Let's begin with a prayer, and then I'll introduce our subject. Father, we're mindful of all the things that are bothering us right now. We're concerned about the pandemic, the people who are sick, those who've died. We're concerned about the separation that we experience, the isolation, and we're grateful that tonight we can be together in a class. We pray that you would bless us in our study, that you protect us, that you encourage us to practice those things that will help to keep us safe, and that we'll do so with a great deal of zeal and determination. We're thankful for the study we're about to engage in and ask you to guide us as we participate in it. In Christ's name, amen. Let me give you just a little brief history. When Shirley and I came here to what was then the Granny White Church in 1986, Charles Chumley was teaching this auditorium class and had done so for a good many years and continued on for quite a while. He always taught out of the Gospel Advocate quarterly. Sometimes I think we get the feeling that quarterly started right after Pentecost because it's been around for a long time. In the late 80s, the name was changed to Foundations to make it sound a little more current, I guess. I went to work at the Gospel Advocate in 1996, and within a matter of 2 or 3 years, I was given the responsibility of editing the adult curriculum, which meant that I was responsible for seeing to it that all the lessons were planned for both Foundations and Companion, which is our annual book. The quarterly has 13 lessons in it. Companion has 52 lessons, all of those for a single year. They're written by 2 different people. I get to choose the writers, I pick the topics, I decide on the subheadings, and then I edit all of this. So I've been living with this for a long time. We try to work about 4 or 5 years ahead. I'm right now working on the subjects for 2024-25. So that lets you know that I'm hoping the Advocate's going to keep going, and I am too. Back 2 or 3 years ago, in making some plans for this year, I got the notion that it would be good to take a couple of quarters out and just look at the role of Peter in the book of Acts, and then later the role of Paul in the book of Acts. We started the quarterly of Peter in Acts on the first Sunday in March. 3 Sundays later, we were no more. A few people in my class told me later, I'm still reading Peter in Acts. I did too. I read all my lessons for the whole quarter. When it came time to buy the books for this quarter, for the summer quarter, I bought 50 books. They rode around in the trunk of my car for a couple of months, hoping that one of these days I can take them to the building and leave them there. And finally said to Kent Gallagher one day, who's now over adult education, Kent, I've got a whole bunch of quarterlies I can use on a Wednesday night if you all decide we can do that. So that's where we are. We're going to try to study what we started out with. Supposedly we're going to start out with the first Sunday in June. You will notice when you look at the book, and I hope all of you picked up one. If you didn't, get one as you leave. There are no dates on the lessons. We decided to leave the dates off because we didn't know when people would be studying these. And so it became a rather convenient thing. You could do it on a Wednesday night or Sunday morning or Sunday night or whatever. I know of one church that's presently using theirs for their Sunday night service. The preacher just preaches on that lesson. That's got 13 weeks already planned ahead. So that's where we are. So what I wanted to do tonight is just simply introduce the idea of the book of Acts and the role of the apostles there, and then we'll look at the first lesson on next Wednesday night. When I was studying the book of Acts under Matt Craig nearly 60 years ago, hard to believe, I remember Mac saying, the book of Acts is called the Acts of the Apostles. It ought to be called some of the Acts of some of the Apostles, because it's not designed to be exhaustive. As a matter of fact, we have one listing of all the original apostles in Acts chapter 1, verse 17, the same list that you find in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We have 4 of those apostles who are mentioned later in the book of Acts. Judas is mentioned at the end of chapter 1 when he commits suicide. Peter and John are mentioned in the first few chapters as they do some things together, preaching, healing, going to prison, some activities that take place through about the 5th or 6th chapter. James, the brother of John, is executed by Herod in chapter 12. Luke says he died by the sword. I'm assuming he was beheaded. That may or not be the case. So if you want to talk about all of the original apostles, we don't have much about them in the book of Acts. Some people get confused when Philip goes down to Samaria to preach. That's not Philip the apostle. That's Philip, one of those 7 who were appointed to take care of the widows in the church in Jerusalem. We sometimes call them deacons. There's that Philip. So don't get them confused. You also have 2 Jameses in the book of Acts. James, the brother of John, as I said, was executed in chapter 12. We have James, the brother of Jesus, who presides over the Jerusalem conference and appears to have become an elder in the church of Jerusalem. Because later in Galatians, Paul talks about going up to Jerusalem and meeting with the, what he called the leaders or the elders, and one of those is James. Pillars of the church, he calls them. So who was Peter? Who was Paul? Why do these 2 men take such prominence? Well, we know the story of Peter. His story is told in all 4 Gospels. We learn a great deal about him. We learn that he's a fisherman. He's called from his job to follow Jesus along with his brother Andrew. We know that he was not a particularly well-educated man. When he and John appear before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 4, the Sanhedrin calls them ignorant and unlearned men. They were not noted for their education. And we sometimes kind of talk about the roughness of Peter. He responds with a great deal of emotion, with a great deal of fervor, not always very logical, but that's a part of his background. A fisherman, become a preacher. I don't mean anything too much, but the language may have been a bit salty sometimes. What else do we know about Peter? Well, we know he didn't travel a lot. He pretty well stayed in the area, just as Jesus had said, you're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. We don't get Peter traveling a great deal. We don't know a whole lot more about him outside the Gospels and Acts, except for 2 or 3 references he makes about himself in his 2 letters, 1st and 2nd Peter. He gives us a few more details about himself. Most of those come at a later date, later in the 1st century. But this is Peter. Who was Paul? Well, Paul was not one of the original 12. As a matter of fact, he describes himself as one who was born out of due time. He didn't come along like the other apostles did. In fact, he was very much in opposition to them. He did everything he could to wipe them out. He came along through a miraculous conversion. When we look at Peter in Acts, he's going to he's going to be predominantly in the first 12 chapters of Acts. You can just go down and look at them. Every chapter, there's something that Peter takes charge of. Chapter 1, Peter leads the group in making the choice of Matthias to take the place of Judas. Chapter 2, Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost is the only sermon by an apostle that Luke records. Chapter 3, he and John go up to the temple and they heal a lame man. And they preach, and they get arrested, and they're put in prison. That's Peter's first imprisonment. In chapter 4, not much about Peter there, but in chapter 5, he encounters Ananias and Sapphira, which is one of the first serious problems in that church. And you go on and look at a few other things where he pops up. He's here, he's there, he's noted for this. He is imprisoned 3 times in the book of Acts. And each of those times, God arranges for his escape. And it's done in rather miraculous form. But then here's Paul. What do we know about Paul? Well, we talk about him in terms of his background. We know that we know where he's from. We know something about his education. He's highly educated. In fact, he says in the Galatians, in the letter to the Galatians, that he was well ahead of most of his other friends in his knowledge of the old law. He was deeply committed to that law. He's going to refer to it over and over again in his letters. In fact, Paul will probably quote from the Old Testament more than any other writer in the New Testament. Peter has a few quotations from the Old Testament, two particularly in his sermon on Pentecost, a couple of references in his two letters, but Paul is constantly quoting from the Old Testament. He goes back over and over again to the very root of it all. He talks about God's promise to Abraham, and he reveals the fulfillment of that promise in the coming of Jesus. It's as if Paul felt the responsibility to reach way back into the ancient times and pull all of that into the 20th century and say, this is what God was talking about. This was what God had planned. We admire Paul's brilliance. I think he was a brilliant man. We admire his skill. We admire his people ability, his people talent. He knows how to deal with folks. We also admire and worry at times that he can become extreme. He is when we first meet him. Here's a man who said, I thought I ought to do many things that were contrary to the will of Jesus. And he was willing to take them on. Next week, we're going to talk about Paul the persecutor. And one of the questions I want to raise is, what motivates a persecutor? What made him think he had to take on the whole world? Well, there's some folks like that nowadays. They're just convinced that if I don't do it, God's not going to get it done. And that's kind of the motivation that seems to direct Paul. We know that Paul studied under the feet of Gamaliel. Apparently, he and his family moved to Jerusalem when he was fairly young so that he could get that education. He describes himself in the book of Philippians as being a Hebrew of the Hebrews. You know, nobody who's more concerned with about our religion and our heritage and our plan as I am. A Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Pharisee, no question about where his allegiance lay. He stays with it all the way through. So we have all that kind of background into the personality of Paul, a man from Tarsus. And he comes to Jerusalem and becomes so involved in his drive to wipe out Christianity. It's almost as if Paul is saying, who is this upstart Jesus? Where did he come from? What's he all about? We got to get rid of this. Appropriately enough, Jesus had warned the disciples that blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely. Rejoice to be exceedingly glad, for so persecuted they the prophets before you. Interesting that Paul knew about persecution because he knew about the prophets. He knew what happened to them. Well, he's ready to do it to Jesus and to Jesus' followers. That's going to become a part of his emphasis. And then we have that amazing action on the road to Damascus. Paul tells us about his conversion 4 times. It's in Acts 9, Acts 17, Acts 22, and Galatians 2. The Galatians account is not as detailed as those in Acts, but that's where he tells us a little bit about it. In fact, a lot of Galatians is autobiographical. Paul talks an awful lot about his background and where he's from and what he's about and what has motivated him. But that miracle was so astounding. It was going to come up over and over again as the testimony of his role as an apostle. I find it interesting when he and Barnabas go on the first mission journey in Acts 13. They go to Cyprus, and they encounter Sergius Paulus, who is the Roman official on the island of Cyprus. And he has a sorcerer named Elymas, or Bar-Jesus, who's kind of in his court, and Elymas opposes what Peter and John are doing and tries to disturb all the kinds of things, or what Paul and Barnabas are doing. And apparently Paul remembered what it was like on the road to Damascus when he was struck with blindness, what it was like to go 3 days without seeing anything. So in order to shut up Elymas, he strikes him with blindness. It's kind of like, I endured this, man, let you see how it feels. It was a way to say to that man, you better pay attention to what we're talking about. It's serious business. It's meaningful. It's important. And so we're going to follow Paul through the rest of the book of Acts, picking up with his conversion in Acts 9. We actually meet him a couple of chapters earlier, just a brief encounter. But from Acts 9 onward, Paul is going to be the dominant figure. We'll see him through 3 mission journeys. We'll see him establish churches widely in Europe. He goes across Asia Minor. He's responsible in part for the church in Corinth, the church in Philippi, the church in Ephesus, the church in Colossae, the churches in Galatia. You read the Galatian letter, it does not refer to the church in Galatia. It is the churches in Galatia. Plural, more than one there. And Galatia is a province, not a city. Paul makes his way to Rome, which for most people was the idea of reaching just the end of the world. If you can just get to Rome, the eternal city it was called. Paul goes to Rome with one great motivation. I'm going to go to Spain. I'm going to go to Spain. Whether he ever reached Spain, we don't know. Some early church historians speculate that Paul may have been responsible for taking the gospel to England. We don't know that from the Bible. We don't even know if he got to Spain. But I don't even probably believe he got to Spain and he wanted to go to England. He'd go to England, because that was the kind of motivation he had. Here was a man driven by his faith, his determination. It was almost as if Paul said, I've got a lot of stuff I've got to cancel out. I look back at what I did and why I did it and how I treated people, and somehow I got to make up for that. And some of us feel that way. We know that there are things that have happened in our lives that we think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I'd been smarter. I wish I'd been nobler. I wish I'd been wiser. Somehow I've got to live down that stuff. And Paul had that to live down. I'll just mention in passing, but we know him by 2 names. He's Saul and Paul. Saul is his Hebrew name. You remember he's from the tribe of Benjamin. The most important Benjamite in the early days of the Bible was Saul the king. Did this Saul, when he was born in Tarsus, did his parents say, let's name him for the king? Could be. Both men are named Saul, both in the tribe of Benjamin. The very name, to give him the same name their first king had, that ought to be self-motivating. That says we expect something out of you. We encourage you. And so he becomes Saul. As he begins working in the European countries, we pick up the name Paul, which is his Greek name. So a Hebrew name, you have a Greek name, and that's how we make our distinction between those 2 names. We've come to know him more readily as Paul, and that's the name we apply to him most often. I said earlier we know a little bit about Peter from his 2 letters. We'll learn a lot more about Paul from his 13 letters. Paul wrote an enormous amount in the New Testament. He wrote letters to all those churches, and then he wrote letters to individuals. We have the letters to the church at Corinth, 2 of those letters. He implies in those 2 letters that there were probably 2 other letters to Corinth that we don't have. He was a great correspondent, and he had written that church 2 other times, trying to solve some of their problems. He has the letter to the church in Rome, the Romans. And then we have Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And then Paul begins to write personal letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon. So you have church letters, you have personal letters. We love the personal letters because they give us a little more insight into the man. One of the things I want to note next Wednesday night, I think it's Sunday, isn't it? I'm up here teaching, it has to be Sunday. One of the things I want to think about next Wednesday night when we look at this is that Paul is described in the first reference we have to him in the book of Acts. He's called a young man. You and I both know that covers a multitude of sin. I don't know what that means, but we are fascinated by the fact that in his career, as a Christian, Paul gathered around himself a lot of young men. It was if, here's why I started, here's how I got into it. I want to encourage them. And so we have John Mark, we have Titus and Timothy, and then we pick up some others like Onesimus. I don't know what his age was. But Paul surrounds himself with Epaphras and Epaphroditus and Onesiphorus, and the names just go on and they just pile up. Read the 16th chapter of Romans and look at all those, 23 people he refers to in that chapter. You and I'd have to check our phones and look at our contact list, see if we know 23 people to refer to. But Paul was interested in others, and it may have come from the fact that he started as a young man himself, and he wanted to encourage other young men in the same way. Now I wanted to look just a little bit about these two men we've been talking about, Peter and Paul. I think there's some ways in which they're comparable, and there's certainly some ways in which they contrast. They're comparable in the fact that they both are devoted to preaching the gospel. Now, Paul's devotion came later than that of Peter. Peter had begun when he first started following Jesus, and he had a lot to learn along the way, and he made some mistakes, and he had to be reprimanded, and he had to be corrected. But from Pentecost onward, he's pretty strict in his defense of the gospel. As I said, Paul comes later. We speculate that Paul was probably converted about 3 years after the crucifixion. And in those 3 years, he had been quite a troublemaker for that early church. But after that conversion, he took on major opportunities, faced major challenges, and was himself mistreated. And that list that he gives us in 2 Corinthians about the number of times he was in prison and the number of times he was beaten and the number of shipwrecks he endured, and that great lengthy list that says, I've been through it all. I've been tested. And in the account of that monstrous storm the ship's engaged in Acts chapter 24, 25, 26, Paul says to the men on board that ship as they were waved around by the storm itself and had already begun throwing things overboard and were convinced they were not going to survive, Paul said, an angel has spoken to me from the God I love and the God I serve. And if you'll abide in the ship, you'll be saved. Paul was going to set that boundary right there that he sets in his letters to the church. If you abide in the church, you're going to be saved. You have a better chance at it. So in temperament, they're very different. I said in the beginning, we think of Peter as rather emotional and fiery and outspoken, speaks often before he thinks, a malady that some of us suffer from and try to control. Paul, on the other hand, seems to be much more controlled. He thinks matters through before he spells them out, and there are times when his logic, notably in the book of Romans, kind of overwhelms us. It's, Paul, I'm not sure I'm following what you're saying there. I think that's right, but I'm having trouble sorting that all out because you're running ahead of me. You know what it's like to talk to somebody that you have to acknowledge, frankly, just knows a little bit more than you do, and you're trying to keep up with where he or she is going. And that's kind of the way I feel in some of Paul's letters. His dealings with those churches, Scott last Sunday mentioned this, and I was going to follow up on it. The church at Ephesus, what a grand congregation. The church at Ephesus is important not only because Paul was there when the church was started. He suffered persecution there. There were people who tried to kill him, and the Roman soldiers had to pull him out and protect him. They were threatening to kill him as he was led out of the city, and his nephew found out about a plot to kill him and went and told an official, and they got it solved. The church at Ephesus. And then he writes that wonderful letter to the church at Ephesus, a letter that describes the importance of the church, It describes marriage. It describes human relationships. Talks about not stealing and not lying and lists all of those kinds of things in Acts 5 that are so important, in behavior, or in Ephesians 5 that are so important. Talks about families, has advice for children, advice for parents, fathers and mothers, advice to servants, advice to masters. And then Scott mentioned last week, we come back to Ephesus when he sends Timothy there. And Timothy, I want you to take care of the church at Ephesus. In the same way, he sends Titus to the island of Crete and says to Titus, you have two jobs there. You set in order the things that are missing in the church. Set in order. Straighten out anything that's confusing and wrong. And you appoint elders in every church. Every church, which says there's more than one congregation in Crete. He puts a lot of responsibility on those two young men. And then, Scott noted in his lesson last week, we come back to Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2, the letter to the church at Ephesus. He also mentioned the Apostle John having a connection with the church at Ephesus. There's a good possibility that an older man named John was an elder in the Ephesian church. It'd be a great realization to think that John might have been an elder in the church. Peter kind of disappears from the book of Acts after chapter 12, except for one other reference. He comes back into the book in Acts 15 when that conference is held in Jerusalem about, are we going to require that Gentiles practice the Mosaic law? Are they going to have to respect dietary laws? Are they going to have to respect days and festivals? Are they going to have to practice circumcision? And this became such a pressing issue. The Jews who'd done it all their lives said, yeah, they have to do that. I had to do it, you have to do it. When I was going to grad school, I found out that I had to have a reading knowledge of 2 foreign languages. And I kept wondering why. Shirley made the observation one day, because the teachers who are teaching you had to do it and they expect you to do it too. And I think there was a lot to that. I endured it, you can endure it. And it was a matter of endurance. But it's kind of like, we're going to hold on to this. And so there's a meeting in Jerusalem with the elders of the Jerusalem church. James, the brother of Jesus, is apparently an elder there, and he takes the lead. But Peter speaks up. Why Peter? Because he had been to Caesarea. He had preached to a Gentile family. He had converted a Gentile family, Cornelius and all of his family. And Peter was saying, God never said anything about that, about them. He not only accepted them, he gave them the Holy Spirit. And so the decision in Jerusalem was, no, we're not going to require that. And they wrote a letter and sent it out to the Gentile churches. Here are the things that are expected of you. The kind of thing you and I would do if we were helping a young congregation get started. Here are the things that are really necessary. Here's what you need to focus on. But you don't have to go back to a law that was given to Moses thousands of years ago and incorporate that into your life. We don't know what else happened to Peter until we encounter him in his 2 letters, much toward the end of the New Testament. The assumption is that he probably wound up in Rome, where he was executed. Tradition says he asked to be crucified upside down because he didn't deserve to die the way Jesus died. That's tradition. I don't know. But as we go through this quarterly, as we look week after week at what was happening to Paul, we're going to start talking about him as the persecutor. It's kind of a bad thing, I guess, to begin studying a person's life and take the negative first. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the negative. What was he doing and why was he doing it? What motivated him? And we understand very quickly from that first lesson why the Jerusalem church was so skeptical of him. It was Barnabas who finally went over to Tarsus and said to Paul, come over to Antioch and help me with the church. They really need us over there. And nobody wanted Paul around. Do you know what he's been doing? Do you know this man? Do you know his history? And when he got to Jerusalem, it was even worse. He had a lot of baggage to take care of. And so we'll look at that as we move along. We'll talk about his mission journeys, talk about his miracles, and there are a few. His sermons are in depth, they're detailed, and they're meaningful. And the things he suffered are very important also. We'll have some of the acts of some of the apostles, two of them, Peter and Paul. Kind of nice, their names both start with the letter P. We could hold on to that, but that's a good thing a preacher would like to have. Carol Ellis, one time in one of his classes at Lipscomb, talked about 14 points about Paul, and he had 14 P's. Paul was prepared, Paul preached, and I don't know what the rest of the list was, but, some of us like that alliteration. I do it sometimes myself. Well, that's kind of what the groundwork I wanted to lay for tonight. And appreciate your being here. If you didn't get a book, please get one and read your assignment for next week. Thank you very much.